Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm really excited to have you here. If you are someone thinking about getting into the world of Java development, then this video for you. Today we are going to talk about one of the most powerful and widely used framework in the Java ecosystem, that is Spring Boot, because Spring Boot is very important nowadays in Java development. I know there are a lot of hypes around Spring Boot right now, and you might be wondering, what is Spring Boot, why is it so popular, and what do I need to learn before I start using it? Well, in this video we will answer all of these questions and much more. Let's start with the basics. Spring Boot is a Java-based framework that built on the top of Spring framework. But here is the thing, it's not just a regular framework. Spring Boot makes it incredibly easy to create production-ready application with minimal setup and configuration. In other words, you don't need to manually set up everything yourself. It does all heavy lifting for you. In traditional Spring framework, you had to do a lot of configuration, whether it was setting up a web server, database connection, or defining beans and application context. But with the Spring Boot, you get auto configuration. This means Spring Boot can detect what you need and configure it for you, and saving you a lot of time and efforts. So, what makes Spring Boot so different from the other framework out there? Here are the main things. Auto configuration. Spring Boot takes care most of the configuration for you. So you can focus on writing applications business logic. And second one, standalone application. You don't need an external web server like Tomcat or JT. Spring Boot comes with embedded web server, so everything you need to run the application is already built in. Then production ready features. With the Spring Boot, you can add features like health checks, metrics, and application monitoring without much efforts. Let's talk about why it is so popular. Spring Boot is a widely used in industry for several reasons. First one, speed of development. It's fast to develop application with Spring Boot. Since you don't need to deal with complex configuration, you can focus only on building your application's feature. Second one, microservices architecture. With the rise of microservices, Spring Boot is the go-to framework for creating independent and scalable microservices. It helps you to break down large monolithic application into smaller and manageable services. Then its large community and resources. There is a huge community of developers around Spring Boot, so it's easy to find resources, tutorials, and support when you need help. Then integration with other Spring project is also easy. Spring Boot seamlessly integrate with other projects in Spring ecosystem, such as Spring Security, Spring Data, Spring Cloud, and making it an excellent choice building enterprise application. Prerequisites. Before we dive into Spring Boot, it's important to discuss what you need to know beforehand. Learning Spring Boot is much more easier if you already have a solid foundation on core Java and Spring. framework. Prerequisite. Before we dive into the Spring Boot, it's important to discuss what you need to know beforehand. Learning Spring Boot is much more easier if you already have a solid foundation on core Java and Spring framework. To work with Spring Boot, you need to comfortable with core Java concepts. There are many resources to learn core Java online tutorials, books, and even free courses on platforms like Coursera, Udemy, and YouTube. The goal is to get comfortable with the language itself before diving into the frameworks. Then Spring Framework. While Spring Boot make it easier to develop application, it's built on the top of Spring Framework. So you need to know some key concept of Spring. These include dependency injection, inversion of control. Spring uses this principle to manage application component and promote loose coupling. Then Spring being an application context. Understanding how Spring manage the life cycle of your object and component is essential. Don't worry, we will touch on these concepts as we learn about Spring Boot. You don't have to master Spring Framework first, but it definitely helps to have basic understanding. Now let's talk about how Spring Boot is related to the Spring Framework. As I mentioned earlier, Spring Boot is built on top of Spring. So it inherits many great features that Spring provides. But Spring Boot is not a replacement of the Spring framework. It's actually a tool that simplifies the working with Spring. With the Spring framework, you typically write lot of configuration to get your app up and running. You have to set up lot of XML files, configure beans manually, set up web server, and much more. Spring Boot simplify all of that by auto configuration, embedded server, and simpler dependency management. In auto configuration, you automatically configures your application based on the libraries you use. So you don't have to manually write configurations. Then embedded server. You don't need to worry about configuring a web server. Spring Boot has built in it. Then simpler dependency management. Spring Boot handles your dependencies and give you right version of it automatically. So you don't have to figure it out which version library are compatible. Let's now take a look at some key features that make Spring Boot so attractive for the developers. Auto configuration. Spring Boot auto configuration takes care a lot of setup work for you. For example, if you are using MySQL database, Spring Boot will automatically set up necessary configurations for database connections without having manually to do it. Then embedded server. Spring Boot come up with the embedded server like Tomcat. This means you don't have to worry about the setting up external web server for your application. Then production ready features. Spring Boot include features for monitoring and managing your application such as health check, metrics, and logging. You can easily add these things like Spring Boot actuator to your app for better production management. Alright, now you have pretty good understanding of what Spring Boot is, why it is so popular, and what you need to know before diving in. If you have any questions or need clarification, Feel free to leave a comment below and thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video.